Hello, guys. Good evening and welcome to today's session. I believe we should be on this call. Please, if you're on Discord or WhatsApp, go ahead and drop a message so that others can join the class. We'll do a 30-second will. So, all right, guys, I think we're good to go. Hi, Will. Hello, Will. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Okay. Hi everyone, welcome to today's class. And yesterday we looked at
Hello,
flex
Ella.
system.
Can you hear me? Will, if you can hear me, please unmute your mic and speak. Thank you.
I'm speaking. Can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me, everyone? Okay,
Yeah, I
so
can hear you now, Will. You can go ahead.
in our previous class we looked at flex system, and we talked about we talked about how to use flex, and how we could identify various layout that we could use flex for. So today we're going to look at grid system, but before we do that, we are going to. There's one more thing. I wasn't sure if I talked about it yesterday with flex. I'm just going to talk about it today. Then we go to grid system. Okay. So 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 basically we there's something I want to introduce to you guys. So yesterday, when we talked about flex, we identified what a flex container is, and we identified that this is the row can be referred to as a flex container, and flex containers could house various flex items, right? Like the various columns we have, we could house them. Yeah, and we did a bunch of examples explaining how flex work and all that stuff. So today we are gonna look into um, grid system, but there's something I want to talk about in Flex before we look into that, and that is what we refer to as uh, um, it's more about the alignment. So when we looked at alignment with Flex, we looked at it on the row layout, on the row section. So basically on this part. However, there are alignments we could work with on the column section, right? So for example, you see this column 3 we have here, we could align this particular column separately by using the align self property. So you say align self. So when you say align self, you could choose how you want the alignment. And once you do that, as you can see, it went down, meaning it's following its own the alignment we defined specifically for it. So this is flex system with self alignment that I want to just touch on. So now let's move on to our grid system, right? So grid. Just like flex, grade is used to arrange stuff in rows and column, right? And like flex, grade, you could do a lot of you could do a lot in terms of how you want to experiment with your grid and all that stuff. So let us jump right into it. So here in our, I'm going to get rid of some code we have here. So I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to get rid of this. And I'm going to comment on this. And then on our columns, I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to leave it. I'm going to uncomment on this. And all this stuff here, I'm just going to get rid of it. Get rid of this as well. Get rid of this. Okay, then I'm gonna allow this to work. I'm going to uncomment on this. So we have a bunch of divs now. Okay. So now this display we have here, I'm going to change it to grid. And that's how you make something display grid, right? So when you say display grid, your HTML element is going to be a grid. So if we go to our web page, sorry, I think it's this one, yeah. So if we go to our web page, right, and if we refresh, good. If you look at this now, you can see you now have this stuff called grid here, right? So this is what we used to, this is how you know if something could be displayed as grid. And you can see a bunch of numbers, right? A bunch of numbers and all that stuff. So this represents the amount of row, and this represents the amount of column. So in this case, we just have one row and one column. So as you can see, just one row and one column, right? That's what we have. This is called row 2, this is row 3, row 4, row 5, and all that stuff to row 8, right? But in terms of the number of column, you could see we just have one column right here. All these numbers are going to come into play later on. So let's just explore grid a little bit more. So first, let's talk about aligning how certain things affect in grid. So for example, if we say align content center, you could see in grid, what it does, it affects the entire row, right? And columns, as you can see, and place them at the center of the grid. So we have this as our grid, and it's placing each row at the center. And as you can see, it's applying it on the cross axis, right? On the cross axis, not on the main axis. Unlike Flex, that it was justified content tends to apply on the main axis. As you can see, it's applying on the cross axis when it comes to grid, right? So now next is how align items work. So when it comes to grid, um, instead of align items, we have something called also we have justify content. I think we have justify items. Yeah. So justify items. you could see justify items work on the it works on each individual um, column, right? But unlike justify content, justify content tends to work this way, whereby it affects the entire grid itself, right? But align justify items affect the items. How do we know? Now, when we use justify items, you could see that there's this kind of red background here to indicate that the grid itself wasn't changed, right? The grid itself wasn't changed. However, if we apply justify content, you could see the red stuff is just within the content, within the grid items itself. So this affects the entire grid, but justify content, justify items just affect the grid items individually, right? But this affects the entire grid itself, which is this applied on a row level. Justify content is applied on a row level, right? Align items, justify items rather, is applied on an item level or a grid item level or the column level. All right. So this is for how the justify content and stuff affects your grid. So the next thing comes, how do we create multiple columns, right, and multiple rows? Well, if we go back to our code, there's this thing called grid. So you have what we call grid template rows, right? So with this, you can define the amount of row your grid should have. So in this case, let's say 4, right? Then you have uh, grid template columns as well. So grid template columns, right? So now this grid template row, how it works is that you specify the amount of height each row is going to have. So you do something like this. So 15 rem, 15 rem, 15 rem, right? So with this, we've defined um, we've defined 4 rows, right? 4 rows. So if we go to our browser, let's refresh, right? Now, if you look at our grid, if you look at this grid, by default, you could see that we've defined 4 rows, but we have more rows, and the reason is because we have like way more in grid. When you define the number of rows, if you have so many content that doesn't fit into that, grid automatically creates those what's it called, the additional rows needed to get things work. So as you can see, right, this is the number of rows we defined. You can see 4 of them being highlighted: the first, the second, the third, and the fourth. You can see it's been highlighted. However, the other rows we automatically created because we needed them. I don't know if I'm making sense. So this is one way of defining grid template rows. Next is grid template columns. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to define 3 rows and 3 columns and show you how it works. So grid template columns. So you could see now if we go back to our code, you can see now we have 3 rows and 3 columns, right? So see, um, let's highlight it. So you could see we have 3 rows, row 1, row 2, row 3, and 3 columns, column 1, column 2, and column 3, right? So you could see that even if our content has bigger space, right? Even if our content has bigger space, you could see that the grid is not making use of all the available space, because this is how we define the grid itself. So if we want to make this figure more accurate, then what we have to do is to say 60 rem, which is the original width of our the original value for our width, right? We'll now say 60 rem divided by um, 3, and that is going to give us 20. So for it to use the available space, it means our columns, our rows could be normal, but for the columns, which determines the width, it has to be like, we have to make it like bigger by giving them 20, 20 each. So 20 and 20. Oh, sorry, 20. So now you could see our grid now fits everywhere. You could see the lines stretch from beginning to end. But the black box is done, right? And the reason for that is because we defined a specific width for our black boxes. So once we get rid of that width, you could see now it's filling the available space. If you guys are wondering, this white space around it is because of this margin, right, that we have here. So if we get rid of that, you could see the black space filling everything totally. So I want you guys to understand that width affects whatever width value, even if you define the width in your grid row, right? Even if you define it there, if your grid item has its own width, that is what is going to take precedence. And this also applies to height as well, right? So if we should increase this height here to 25, you can see the height is taking precedent over the grid. So you may be asking, this is problematic, right? How can we be sure of what value to use for the height and width and all that stuff? It's just a bunch of calculations, isn't it? Well, there's also a way to achieve this with way less code and way less complication, right? So now we have this code. Now, if you see, when creating our different rows, we had to do a lot of repetition here, right? So in order to not have this kind of repetition, there's this good CSS function we could use called repeat. So repeat takes 2 arguments. It takes um, the repeat takes the number of times you want to repeat it and the value at which you want to repeat. So this time I'll say I want to repeat 3 times and I want 15 rem. So we have it. So here I can say I want to repeat. So I want to repeat 3 times, but I want 20 rem. So with that, we've lessened the amount of code we needed to write, and we actually had achieved the same thing, as you could see, right? Um, so this width we have here, if we get rid of it, now you could see it's filling up stuff. Now, instead of using margin to give space within either flex or grid system, instead of using margin as the factor for giving space, there's something called grid column, column gap and row gap, right? So you could do this called You could instead say row, row gap, right? And you could put the value you want, 1 rem. I think we used, yeah, it's 1 rem, isn't it? All right. And for the column, so as you can see, there's now spaces in between rows, right? Then for column, all you just have to say is column gap, and the value you want. And now you could see there are now spaces. So if you look at the browser now, you could see, uh, let's refresh. So you could see our spaces are much more better, right? But you have to consider something. So since you are giving now, when you use column gap and row gap, your grid could grow past the original value you wanted it to be. So for example, we have our grid to have a width of 60 rem, but because we've given it a column gap of 1 rem, our grid has grown twice the it has added 2 more rem. So that added this gap here and this gap here, and that is why you can see the grid is extending past the designated area. So basically it's the addition of these 2 gaps that was added. So with that, we have to reduce those value here to make up for it. So if we should remove 2 rem from 20, we're going to have 18. If I should reduce this to 18 rem, so the column gap 1 rem. Oh, sorry, yeah, I just need to remove, I think just one, since this is a value we added here. So with that, we'll be able to get back the grade. But it's also a bunch of calculation that can be very, very difficult to fully work out. So how can we now fix this whole issue? There's a measurement unit specifically for grade that we could use at this point in time, and that is called fraction. So instead of saying 15 rem or whatever for the row, or 20 rem for the column or whatever, I can just say 1 FR. So what it means, it does this, it takes all the calculation you need to do, it does it for you. So as you can see with what we have here, when we are trying to do the calculation ourselves to know the appropriate amount of space to give to get to make our div fill in properly, you can see it was like very, very difficult to get it correctly, right? But now since we're using one fraction, it means just like how flex basis and flex grow has growth factor and all that stuff. What we are doing now, we are saying that um, it should take away this column gap and this row gap, right? And it should divide the remaining space equal. It should take away this column gap, whatever the pixel value is, right? And it should take away that from. It should take that away, and whatever space that is remain, it should divide it by 3 equally amongst every column, and that is why we have this. So this is what we refer to as fraction unit. And there's something I want to make clear in grid. When you are working with grid, please don't ever use percentage whenever you are working with grid. Don't. It's just, instead of using percentage, use fraction. But don't ever use percentage with grid. Next would be, we could also apply this fractional unit to the row as well. So we could say 1 FR as well, and it would work. However, it's going to be taking the height of, whenever we do this, the height of this column will now be the base for the grid. You get. So naturally, when you create grid, you may not give your columns width or height. because the content of the grid would determine the width or height. So you may have something like this, having this fractional unit. Just like how ratio works, some units could take larger spaces than others. So for example, I can come here, right? And instead of doing this repeat, I'm going to write them one after the other. So I'm going to say 1FR. Here, I'm going to say 2FR. And I'm going to say 1FR. So what do you think this is going to give us, right? As you guys must have guessed it. Let's refresh. So as you guys must have guessed it, you can see that the middle box tends to have what? Way larger space compared to the other ones, right? And that is because it has a larger fractional unit. So just like the way we have flex scroll, whereby we could specify some grid elements to have specific fractional unit, right? We could do that with grid as well. However, what if we want this column 5 to only be the one to have this two fractional unit, but the other ones should remain the same? Well, there's something we could do as well. So I'm going to go back and leave this repeat code. However, I'm going to write a code for column 5. So I'm just going to change this 3, or we can use number 2 instead as an example. So here I could just say grid column, right? And in this grid column, let's see. Okay, sorry. This grid column, I'll explain how it works for you guys later. So yeah, I'm misplacing this value basically. So if you want uh, this grid column to be bigger, there's something we could do, right? So we call it grid spanning, right? So basically right now we have our grid. As you could see, this grid, if we want this grid to, if we want a grid, we could make this row, this first column or the second column, or whatever grid item, we could make them span multiple columns or multiple row, right? So that's what grid column or grid row does. So look at these numbers. I remember I said this number is going to come into play, right? So you can see this number here, like I said, represents column, represent row. So we have row 1, row 2, row 3, and row 4, right? Why this column here represent this number here represents column, right? So we have column 1, column 2, column 3, right? So if I want this second column to span between column 2 and column 3, all I have to do is to set how far I should span using the grid column. So now watch what's going to happen. So here in this grid column, if you look at our grid column starts from number 2, and I can span it to what? To 4. So I could come here and do this. So I could say 2 minus 2 divide 4, right? So with this, you can see, right? You can see now this number 2 column is spanning 2 columns. You can see it's spanning from here to here. I don't know if I'm making sense to you guys, right? So this is how you could make it span multiple columns. If I want this number 2 to span multiple rows, then I can do this as well. I can say grid row, right? And I could I could count the rows. So if we should count our rows here, we have 1, 2, and 3. So I could just say grid row as 1 divided by 3. So this divide is more like span. So span from row 1 to row 3. And look at what do we have here. So if we refresh, uh, this is not giving us the desired results. Let's see. Row 1, row 1, and let's see. So spans grid row start 1. Okay, so I think it's supposed to be 2. Is it 2? No, row 1. I'm coming. Row 1. Um, yeah, if you say row 2 is just 2 rows. Row 3 is 2 rows. Please, I'm coming. This spanning between rows sometimes. This could be the calculation could be a little bit tricky. So we have 1, we have 2. So okay, I'm gonna do something just as an experiment. So let me figure out what's going on quickly. So I'm gonna apply that same style for the first one. And okay, so instead of 2, I'm gonna say this should be 1, and this should be 3, right? So good. So the row, okay, what if I say, oh, okay. So the problem is that um, the problem is that our column is spanning just within one row. We are trying to span our row within multiple columns. So that's the issue we are having here, right? I think we do
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yeah, good evening, everyone. Okay, so I think Mr. Will is having network issues. So let's just hold on shortly. We'll be joining back.
My network got interrupted.
Yeah.
I'm back.
Will, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right. Okay, so you, I guess it's your network.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Can go on.
Okay, okay, so I'm gonna continue. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen, and we're just gonna quickly. Can you guys see my screen? Not yet, is it? Okay. So let's just quickly Google this stuff, right? So grid, grid row, uh, grid span, multiple. There's a shorter um uh code to use, but I'm gonna show you. I'm just trying to look for this long one before the second one. Okay. Okay. I'm seeing some code here that makes sense. Okay. So okay. So the short code I was talking about is instead of trying to wrap your hand around this like calculations that we are trying to do, you could just use the word span, right? So you could just say span two, right? And you could just say span two, right? And with this, your grid, your grid automatically just calculates stuff and for you, right? So as you can see, we are having the same problem we were having earlier, even after using the span, right? Even after using the span, meaning um, what we are trying to do is wrong, basically. So that's so basically you can see it gives this space. I don't know if you guys can see that this is actually spanning two rows, but there's like a space here, right? I don't know if I'm making sense. So the code works. It's just that the number of columns we are spanning into is just not doesn't work, right? So we are supposed to span, like for example, if you want to make this blank space filled, we are supposed to span 4 columns, right? So that's the uh, appropriate number. But when we span 4 columns, what happens is that our grid um, our grid tends to like go a little bit, tends to mess up a little bit because now now we are finding it difficult to like span to achieve what we wanted to with what we were trying to do before, right? So trying to even spanning 4 columns didn't even fix the issue we had, right? So the question is, how can we now address this kind of problem, right? And in order to do that, but first of all, I just want you guys to be aware of this code. This span two is the same thing as doing what was it called? Two over four, right? It's same thing as doing it. Okay. So there's also the same thing applies here. So if we span two, so let's say one. So before we did this 1/3. Yeah. So this makes it span multiple columns, right? So some people are very good with these numbers, know how to like do the proper calculations to get this right. So I think this what's the label for this box? Okay. This one it's -3, -2. So I think if I'm not mistaken, this becomes they tend to do like so -4. Then there's like one minus, and we do uh is it this or so -2? I've actually forgot the calculation for. Okay, I think it's -3. I think -3 like this. -3. Then one more will be -2, isn't it? Oh God, this sorry. So even me myself, I tend to find it difficult to properly do this calculation, right? But it's actually a much more easier way to get this done, and that is what we call grid templates, right? So let's go look into grid templates. So now instead of doing grid row and grid column like this, what we could do, we could say we could replace them with grid template areas. So grid template area. Um, so grid template area. So how does this work? Grid template area allows us to define different areas within our grid template. So let me look for the proper definition for it. So grid template areas. Let's see the proper definition for it. Okay, so it defines areas of layout within our grid, right? So that's what it does. So how do we work with grid template areas now, right? So here I'm going to define various areas. So I'm going to say we have column 1, right? And I'm going to say we have column. So this column that I'm doing here, you can give it whatever name you want, right? It's just left to you, right? So, okay, so this is going to be column 2. Oh, sorry, I'm going to call this, column 1, column 2, then column 3, right? So with this, I've defined what this code has done. It has defined 3 columns in one row, right? This is what this code has done. 3 columns in one row. So next, I'm going to define my next row, right? I'm going to say my next row. I can now say column 4, right? Column 4, column 5. Now remember, we are trying to make okay, let me just get it over with. So column 6, and I'm going to do one more. So this becomes column 7, column 8, and column 9, right? So Okay, so this code we have here, I'm going to get rid of them as well. Right? So now this is, so with that done, right? So you could see we've gotten, so with this pattern, right? You see we've gotten what we have before. So now let's start to arrange stuff however we want. So if I want column 2 to span column 3 and column 6 and column 5, right? You can see column 2, column 3, column 4, column 5. So if I want to achieve that with grid template areas, right? All I have to do is to come here and give that entire column the same name, right? So instead of column 3 here, I'll change it to column 2. Instead of column 5 here, I'll change it to column 2. Instead of column 6 here, I'm changing it to column 2. We don't have any effect yet. It's still going to look the way we want. But now, if I come under this column 2 and I said the grid area, so if I come here and I say grid area to be column hyphen 2, watch what's going to happen. So as you can see, oh Christ, I think I'm the one making, I've making like a very serious mistake ever since, and yeah. So the reason why those that stuff we're trying to do with the grid area wasn't working that time was actually because we have a height. So let me explain what I mean, right? So I'm gonna, instead of giving this a height, instead of giving our column a height, I'm gonna give it a padding instead. So I'm gonna say padding should be 15 rem. Okay, I think this is way too much. Let's say 5 rem. Okay, so I'm going to give it a padding instead. This height value has been causing problem for us. So I'm going to comment on this quickly, right? I'm going to comment on this, and I'm going to leave this the way we have it before. And I just want to show you guys that the grid template area stuff works. So I'm going to say, so now we have our grid looking like this, right? We have our grid looking like this, right? So now, if I say grid row, and I say 1 over 3, right? And I say grid, and I say grid column to be 2 over 4, right? We have the result we are looking for. So look at it. Please, I'm just trying to retrace my step back. So the reason why it wasn't behaving this way before was because of this height property here, this height property. It was the reason. So now that we no longer have this height property, right? You can see it's working the way we want. So this number stuff, right? This number stuff, this is it spanned from number 2 to number 4 and column 1 to column 3. You get? So that is how we got this, got it looking this way. However, instead of doing this, right? Instead of doing this, right? We could just use the word span 2 rows and say span 2 columns, and it's going to give us exactly the same result, as you can see, right? Okay, sorry, span. So we say span 2 columns. So it's spanning the column 1 and column 2, just these 2 columns here. It's supposed to be spanning 4 columns. So when we say span 4 columns, we have this instead. So we have this, right? So sometimes using span can, when we say span columns, we are leaving the grid to automatically calculate stuff, right? But if you want to be specific, right, we could now say that it should be from column 1 spanning 2 columns, right? So yeah, so saying column one should span, from column one it should span two columns, right? Then from column two it should span what, four columns, right? So when we do that, let's refresh. So when we do that, you can see we have this now, right? Are you guys seeing it? Right? So sorry, this is supposed to be 3 instead of 2. 3. Yeah. So let's refresh. Good. So you can see now, right? So from this column, as you can see, sorry, it's spanning 3 columns. The reason why it's spanning 3 columns is what we created. So we should use 2 instead, so that we have the, or because remember our original grid, if you should look at the number, um, we are saying from this second one it should span what, from this second from the second point, that the second column, it should span 2 more columns, right? So which is one, this column, and this one. From this second column here, which is this one here, you should span 2 more columns, which is this one and this one. So this is how the span can give us like this design we were trying to achieve, right, with the grid. However, using span and stuff like this can be very, very complicated, especially trying to figure out. Most of the time, you have to do like try and error, like you see me do just now, to get things to fit just right. However, you could get rid of all these complications by using grid template areas. So grid template areas, as you can see with our example here, like I was explaining earlier, when you have a grid template area, so I'm going to get rid of this so that we have more room to see the code properly. So when we are working with grid template areas, you can see that, like because we want the grid to have the column to span 2 rows and 2 columns, we have to label all these things this way and come here and label our grid area to column 2. And would you have it? We have this design, which is exactly what we're looking for, right? We could do more. We could even say, okay, what's going to happen is we want it to span, we want column 2 to span here as well. So if I come here and I label this as well, right? You can see what was going to happen. You see, it's spamming more columns. And when it does this, it's pushing every other element into it's pushing every other element. Why the grid system automatically arrange itself, create more row if needed, or create more columns if needed, right? So that's how grid system works. However, you can't do this. When you use a grid template area, I can't come here and I say grid label here 2, for example, grid column 2. It just doesn't make sense. You can see the grid template area is even shouting. The code it doesn't even work. You get, it doesn't even work, right? You can't do that. It has to be when using same column, same names, they have to flow, right? They have to flow. They can't protrude like this. This won't work, right? It has to be. It has to be in in a manner at which, yeah, the rows and the columns do not what collide. The rows and the columns do not collide. So this is all we could take for grid, right? So we looked at creating our grid, right, using grid template rows and grid template columns, and we look at how we could specify where we want different position of elements to be using that, right? So for example, with the grid template rows and grid template column, if I want this column 2 to be at the bottom, or it will be at the bottom, right? So if I want this column 2 to be at the bottom here, it's actually pretty simple. All I have to do is just specify the appropriate row and column to be there. So in this case, if I say I want the row to be uh, 3 and 5, right? So the row should be from row 3, right? It should span 2 rows. Look at what will happen. You see, it has come to the very bottom, right? It has come to the very bottom. So we could move the element however we want, or a grid item however we want around the grid, right? Or if we are finding it difficult to do this stuff here, we could just do what? We could just use this grid template area to shape our grid however we want. You get. So this is all we could take. This is all I'm going to take for grid system. Let's see if there's anything I've not covered from the curriculum here. So grid layout, defining grid containers, yeah, complex grid layout. So we've looked at that. So so I'm gonna start entertaining questions, right? So please, if you have questions, start asking right away. Hello, can you guys hear me? Do you guys have questions?
Okay, thank you so much, Will, for today's class. So please, everyone, if you are watching on Twitch, YouTube, or LinkedIn, please start dropping your question so Mr. Will can take them. So we'll just have few minutes for that. So please start dropping your questions. Thank you.
Okay, so what's flex is commonly used to grade. Most times people use, personally I hardly use grade, but when it comes for me to use grade, I use it, right? But most of the time, most of the layouts you want to achieve can be achieved with flex, but people commonly use flex more to grade. However, what's commonly used shouldn't be the point. The point should be what your design is, right? So if your design requires you to use flex, you use it. If your design requires you to use grid, you use it. Next question. Okay, do you have any ideas for project that helps us understand grid better? Um, there are um, um, currently I can't say anyone off my head, but um, we could research and look into it. And I'm sorry the whole grid class was a little bit messed up, but what happens is whenever we are building layout and we are going to use a grid system, I'm going to explain the whole grid system again. Hopefully then you guys will understand it better. But yeah, so but I don't really have, I can't mention any materials or projects right now off my head, but we're going to make research and get back to you guys on that. Next question. Okay, before the next question comes in, so what makes grid and what makes flex alike? What makes grid and flex alike? So like I said, flex, you only have one row, and you things can only be arranged into columns inside that one row, right? But grid, you can have multiple rows, and those multiple rows can be you could arrange items however you want inside the multiple columns and the multiple rows that grid has, right? Why they are alike is that they can both arrange things in rows and columns, but grid is way more flexible than arranging stuffs in rows and columns, right? Um, so that's it. Yeah. If you guys have seen UIs like okay, so let me explain. Let me share my screen. I'm going to answer this question. I'm coming. Uh, area have values attached to them. Grid areas, when you are defining them, anyhow you define them, it doesn't really concern the. You could even use numbers for it. It doesn't really concern the grid, as long as you define them in the grid template areas. Whenever you're using them in the grid area, it's just gonna work. So I'm sharing my screen. I want to show you guys a website that you could use grid for when you want to design this kind of layout. Can you guys see my screen? I don't think you can yet. Can you? Okay, so if we go to pixels, right? So let's see. I don't. Okay, yeah, Pixel, right? So if you go to this website, right, you could see this kind of layout, right? Whereby items some span down, some are bigger than the other, right? In this kind of website, you could use grid for it. You get, but I think Pixel designed theirs using Flex. So I'm very sure they use Flex for theirs. Let's see. I'm sure Pixels use Flex for theirs. But this kind of layout is a very good example of where you could use grid for. But I'm pretty sure it was Flex Pixels use. I remember looking into it some time ago, and let's see. Okay, yeah, you can see. So they use Flex for it, right? They use Flex for it. So yeah, they use Flex for the design. So basically, yeah, they use Flex, and each of the Flex item is separated into 3 groups like this. You could see, and that was how they did it. But you could also use grid to achieve this layout. But this company used Flex. So when you have a layout like this, you can use grid for it. Okay, let's go and see. Sorry. Yeah, this one. Okay, so okay, yeah, like I said, you could have like I was explaining earlier, you could use numbers or whatever you want as the names for your grid template areas. It doesn't really matter. It's going to work. So if I share my screen now and show you guys something. Why is it not sharing yet? Please wait. The screen is going to share pretty soon. Oh boy. Okay, start sharing. So if I come here in this grid template areas, right? So let me comment on this and uncomment on this. And you see this cool, right? I'm just going to remove all this cool stuff, and I'm just going to leave it as 1 through 9 and all that stuff, right? And So this should be, I'm just going to change this to 3, 4, 5, 5, 6, right? So I can have that, and I can come here in my grid template areas, right? And I can say grid call, and I can just call the number 2. It's still gonna work. So if we come to our UI here and we refresh, oh wait, it's like numbers didn't work. Why? Let's see. Grid template area 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then grid. I don't know why this didn't work, but it's supposed to, should have worked. Oh, okay. Okay, so I think I made a mistake. 2, 2. Because the second column is right here. No, so um, it should have worked, but the second column is like here, number 2. Yeah, this is 1, 2, 2, 2, 2. Why is this? This should have worked. Okay, but basically you could use, try to use more of alphabets instead of numbers, because it seems the numbers have issues. Okay, so next question. So I don't think I can entertain any more questions. My battery is actually low, and I think my system is going to turn off very soon. Sorry about that. So I think I'll end the class here. What will happen is our next class, I'm going to revisit grade. Waiting me for the time. Thanks a lot. I appreciate your kind words. I really I'm happy to hear that. What I'll do is I'm going to revisit grid one more time just to make it easier for you guys to understand in our next class before we jump into whatever our next class is going to be. All right, so that will be all for me today.
All right, thank you so much, Will. So for those of us that have so many questions, can always come to Discord and we'll attend to it. And also, please make sure you're in class next week, Monday. That is Christmas Day. So please make sure you're in class so that Mr. Will can attend to all your questions that you have. Thank you so much, Will, for today's class. And thank you, everyone, for joining. See you all next week, Monday, same time. Bye, everyone, and good night.